Welcome to the Paper Dice Games podcast. My name is James Saran. This is Season 1, Episode 5, and today I'm going to be talking about Ravenloft, the old school D&D module, how to play RPGs with kids, my projects, and more. Now, to start off today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about a print-and-play game that I played a few years ago and really enjoyed. It is called 1972: The Lost Phantom by Mike Heim. Now, in 1972, The Lost Phantom, you are playing the role of a Vietnam War pilot who's just been shot down and has survived your crash landing, and your goal is to get across the wilderness, the terrain, the countryside of Vietnam to the other side to make sure that you can try and survive that trip and eventually get back and survive. That's basically it. It's a game of survival. The way that this works is the game is printed in, you use a single piece of paper as kind of the gameplay board. On the top are the rules, which are very helpful. Not all the rules, but all the ones you kind of need to know to get started. And on the bottom is kind of the game board, and it's just a hex-based kind of grid. And what you do on your turn is you're going to enter different hexes, which are different kind of regions of the countryside. You're going to roll to determine what terrain type you are entering, and then based on your terrain type, you're going to roll for events on different tables throughout the rest of the rules. And what's going to happen is those events are going to determine what you can and can't do. They might take resources away from you, like health, and then there's some other things you can encounter, like villages or enemy forces or things like that. So I really enjoyed this game to an extent. It was fun. What I really liked about it were two reasons. Number one, the game was a full gameplay experience that was very quick to experience and also had a very small footprint. So again, I could play on just one single piece of paper and just reference the rules as needed. And it really did feel like the game had a beginning, middle, and end. It felt like the complete gameplay experience. So I really liked that about the game. It matched with what the game told me that I was doing. The random tables were also good to an extent in the back. I think there was a lot of creativity in those. The problem with 1972: The Lost Phantom that I had is there's quite a bit of randomness in a few of the entries in the lost table, or in the random tables in the back. They would just kill you outright and the game would end. So I remember in one of my games, my character was trying to get across a field or something like that, and they were sniped by enemy forces, and I had nothing I just made a dice roll and I was just sniped. So I think to an extent you can try and it is a risk mitigation game where if you're going to go out in the open, you know that you're risking getting sniped, and so you do want to try and stick to more heavily wooded areas. But on the other hand, it just doesn't feel good to lose the game outright when I was doing quite well up to that point. So, it's still a game I enjoyed. It's something that I would play again. It's a short game, which is why those types of randomness and quick losses are okay, because you can just start again and print out a new piece of paper, and it's not a big deal. So, 1972, again, The Lost Phantom by Mike Heim. Cool game. Check it out. The reason I'm sharing it today is because I think the system that Mike Heim has created can be used elsewhere. I think it's interesting that he was able to create a relatively quick gameplay experience on a single piece of paper while referencing tables elsewhere, and I think that can be translated into a lot of other game type experiences. So I haven't found a place to land on it yet, but I would at some point like to innovate a little bit on his idea and provide something similar. Provide a tight, very crisp gameplay experience on one piece of paper just by referencing tables elsewhere. And yeah, I haven't figured out what to do with that yet, but it's kind of in the back of my mind, and it's something that I'm considering doing for the future. I'm going to move on to the season focus. This season is all about old school Dungeons and Dragons modules, and to end this season, this episode 5 is the last episode of this season. I'm going to talk about my current favorite old school Dungeon and Dragon module, I6 Ravenloft. I'll hold it up here for the camera, and for those of you listening to the audio, Ravenloft is kind of a dark forest green faded to black cover. It says Advanced Dungeons and Dragons on it with I6 on a bar across the top. And the picture shows a vampire standing in a very gothic castle with gargoyles, just kind of looking off in the distance as lightning crashes in the background and some bats are flying. Now, I'm going to just kind of talk about what you get in the module first, and then I'll talk about what I like about the module. So the inside cover is very, very interesting. I'm no expert on these old school D&D modules, but I haven't seen one like this, because you get the map of the castle, which kind of acts as the dungeon in this particular module. It's called the Castle Ravenloft, but it's not a general 2D bird's eye view map. It's an isometric map, kind of from that top side angle, which is just different. It's very, very cool how it's laid out, very interesting. It gives you depth. It gives you kind of a sense of three-dimensional space, which I really like about the module. It also comes with the 2D map of the kind of the hex grid of the rest of the area around the castle, and another pullout of isometric mapping of the castle itself. It also comes with, for some reason, a full art piece of map, which is basically a kind of like an old school Dracula style pose with the vampire, mouth open, fangs out, hovering above a woman, and then in the background there's bats, and it looks like they're inside the Gothic castle, and on the back are some player aids. And then the module itself, information is also included in the module. So this is an interesting module already from the start, because it is packed with, I guess, better supplies or better resources than a regular module would have. So that was the first thing that caught my eye when I read through this. The next thing I realized is that this module is set up a little bit different than other modules. This module, like the other modules, focuses around a dungeon. In this case, the dungeon is Castle Ravenloft, but the goal isn't necessarily for the characters to go clear the dungeon. The goal of this module revolves around the center of the module, and it's the big bad, whose name is Count Strahd von Zarovich, the vampire. And so the module actually starts off with a full page talking about Count Strahd von Zarovich, the vampire, and this is what's really cool about the module. And the cool thing is that Count Strahd is the linchpin, the core, the most important thing in this entire module, because this vampire is the protagonist. But it's not a protagonist in the sense that as soon as the characters see Strahd, they're going to attack and kill him. Strahd is a genius, and also very, very strong, and has a lot of different things that he's trying to accomplish. And so the story revolves more around Strahd, I guess, than it does the players, and the players are more playing inside Strahd's story. And so it's a little bit of a different approach to a module, which is very, very cool. So this whole first page is very, very important. By the way, I have not run this yet. I do want to. It's very high on my list of RPG games I want to run. I'm also a little nervous because Strahd has to be played very, very well, and so I would need to do a lot of reading on this page and a few other pages if I was going to do that. Now, another cool thing about this module is on the second page. The second page is something called the Fortunes of Ravenloft, and basically what this is it mimics a deck, like a deck of tarot cards or something like that. But really what it is it's a way to create a different gameplay experience each time you play this module. So this does two things in my mind. Number one, if I'm going to run this, I will roll on the Fortunes of Ravenloft and identify, for example, where Strahd might be at any given moment in the castle, identify what fortunes the player characters get as far as little bonuses, and identify Strahd's goals and motivations kind of down the side. Now, as I'm playing the game, though, what this does is it gives you other opportunities to pivot if needed. So I would start the game with Strahd having this goal, or that goal, or the characters having this fortune, or Strahd being in this place. But if something happens, if the characters throw a curveball, if the story just kind of develops in a different avenue, this whole two-page spread is a great resource for me to go back and identify a different avenue for the story to take place. The other thing that the Fortunes of Ravenloft page does is it provides multiple gameplay experiences, so the module can really be played more than once, which is not something, again, you see in a lot of modules. So for these two reasons alone, by the way, this is why this is my current favorite old school Dungeons & Dragons module, because the whole module revolves around Strahd and his motivations, and it's really a story of Strahd, not necessarily the player characters, but also because you have this Fortunes of Ravenloft spread, which gives you multiple ways you can interpret Strahd's motivations, multiple ways you can identify where Strahd might be at any given moment, but also gives you replayability if you want to play it more than once. So it's very, very cool. Continuing on, the module then goes to the Lands of Borovia, and this more tells you where different people and places are in Borovia, and it's just a little hokey. That's maybe my one criticism of it is, I think the story is that the player characters pass through a thick fog, but it's a magical thick fog, and they can't get out. And so they're just stuck in Borovia with this very dangerous genius level vampire, kind of like Frozen 2-esque like that. That's how hokey it is. But it does get you what you want, which is basically puts the player characters on an island with this genius level vampire. And so Borovia kind of explains a few different things. Now, the cool thing about Borovia is that you can learn a lot about Strahd from the places that you go in Borovia, and fortune telling is a big part of this whole module, and so you can get a good sense of, you can get hints as to what Strahd's motivations are. And then the rest of the module really covers Castle Ravenloft, which again is the dungeon, I guess, for the module, but you have those really cool isometric maps, and so it's a little bit more fun, I think, exploring it. Now, the interesting thing about the dungeon is, yes, it's a dungeon, it has your classic monsters, classic treasure, but there's two really great things about it. Number one, it's got some really, really great, kind of deep themes of history. It's Strahd's castle, it's Castle Ravenloft, but other people have inhabited it either before or during his stay here, and the things you find at the castle can actually connect back to the people you talk to in Borovia. And the whole setting is gothic horror, and so it makes a very interesting, you're talking to someone who's a widow, and then you go and see their ghost in the castle, and it makes for an interesting experience. The other thing the castle does is it gives you different ways where you might, or the player characters might meet Strahd, which is not something you normally see. Normally in a dungeon, you work your way through the dungeon, and then one of the last places you go is you encounter the big bad, the big evil, whatever, the person you're going to fight to win the day. Strahd is going to be seen throughout the module, and like the module makes it very clear that Strahd's a genius and must be played as so, but also Strahd's very strong. So the first few times the PCs encounter Strahd, they might not even try attacking him. There might be banter. There's going to be a lot of deception and intrigue between the characters and Strahd, and combat may not be the first thing that comes to mind. In fact, there's a few encounters where if the PCs attempt combat, it's not going to work because of illusions or tricks or things like that. And so it kind of flips the natural, what characters want to naturally do when they see the big bad evil person is normally they want to attack them, but in this module it makes them think a little bit and try and figure out, okay, should we be attacking Strahd at this point, or is that what Strahd wants us to do and has a trap set up, so they have to try and kind of navigate the layers of deception from this evil genius vampire. Then at the end of the module is the kind of the unique monsters, the treasure, that type of thing. And there are a few different endings, actually, depending on how the characters do against Strahd in Castle Ravenloft. Now, I haven't run this. I've only read through the module, but I want to run this really bad, and there's a few reasons for that. Number one, it is a very, I guess it's kind of a forced gameplay experience, but it's so unique, I think it would be okay. I love the idea of running the big bad as someone that the characters see up front and understand who it is and understand that they're an evil genius and very powerful and yada yada yada, and then have to basically exist in the land that is controlled by the big bad while trying to survive, basically staying under the radar and also trying to figure out, okay, what is the big bad trying to do and how do we stop it? I think the fact that Strahd is supposed to be an evil genius and having layers of deception added onto that would be really great. And all of those things kind of combine, along with the fortunes of Ravenloft at the beginning and some of the encounters in the castle. All those combine into a gameplay experience that I imagine would be very, very fun. And I can't wait to try it. I haven't even gotten close yet. Someday, though. Someday I'm going to be playing I6 Ravenloft. If you're interested in playing this, there's two suggestions I have. This is one of the more coveted old school D&D modules, so they're starting to get pretty pricey. So if you have the ability, now would be a good time to buy one because the price is probably only going to go up. They've also done several different iterations of Ravenloft, of this particular module, so you can get what is it called? The 5th edition is very similar. I think it's just called, is it called Ravenloft? I don't remember. You can just look it up. But there is a 5th edition version of this basically, and I have not read it, but one of my friends has gone through it and said it was very, very fun. So you could also go that avenue if you're looking for a similar gameplay experience. Get the 5th edition one. It's probably going to be cheaper, and you can run it in 5e. Now I'm going to move on to some project updates that I have going on. First of all, Dwarf Mine and its new expansions and appendices are out. That's right. If you go to not dwarfmine.com. If you go to paperdicegames.com, you'll see a post right on top there that talks about Dwarf Mine and its expansions. It's available now on DriveThruRPG and itch.io with the new expansions. So just as a reminder, if you were unable to listen to the previous podcasts or you've forgotten, this update includes 2 new expansions, which is the Bloodlines expansion, and the Bloodlines expansion gives you a few random tables to name your dwarf a certain way, but also a unique dwarf leader power, so that your mine, at each mine is going to be a little bit different because your dwarf leader is going to have a different power. And it also has the More Rooms expansion, which gives you, I think, 8 or 9 more rooms. And these rooms are basically, they allow you to experience a different type of mine. So a lot of the rooms have restrictions as to where they can be built. Some of the rooms are quite large, so you have to plan for them. And some of the rooms require that you have fewer other rooms in the mine. For example, one of the rooms requires 3 or fewer hovels to be built in your mine, or 3 or fewer barracks to be built. And that just kind of brings another avenue of gameplay, so you can build a different type of mine rather than experiencing a similar type of mine each time. This new update also includes 3 appendixes. Appendix 1 is basically all rooms on one page, and so that way you don't have to reference a few different pages in a few different places. You can just look there, identify what the costs, requirements, and benefits of the room are. Appendix 2 is the room name generator. If you struggle, like I do sometimes, to create unique and creative rooms every time you build a room in Dwarf Mine, this gives you some ideas and a way to name your rooms. And then Appendix 3 is something I'm very excited about, which is the achievement list in Dwarf Mine. Basically, every time you play Dwarf Mine, you can check on the achievement list, see if you've created or met an achievement, check it off. And when you check it off, it gives you a title that you can add to your dwarf leader to the next time you play Dwarf Mine. So, for example, if you are ever able to kill the dragon in Dwarf Mine, you would then get to add the title of Dragon Slayer to a future dwarf leader when you play Dwarf Mine. And I kind of like to consider that as a way to brag to your friends as you show off your most recent mine and say that, you know, your dwarf leader's name was Brunor Thorgod Dragon Slayer. And they look at the name and they say, oh my gosh, you beat the dragon. And you say, yes, I did. So Dwarf Mine updates are out now. Because this is a new update for Dwarf Mine, I'll give one last chance here to anybody who has not yet purchased Dwarf Mine. It's going to be 50% off for the next week. And if you have already purchased Dwarf Mine, what you can do is just go to the place where you had purchased Dwarf Mine, so that would probably be DriveThruRPG or itch.io, and just re-download the file. The new file should be the updated file, and those expansions will be included in the updated file. So yeah, check it out. Moving on to today's podcast discussion, I want to talk a little bit about how to play RPGs with kids. Now, this is something I have quite a bit of experience with. I was a middle school teacher for 8.5 years and ran Game Club, which was an after-school program for 6 of those years. I have 2 kids that I would consider quite young, you know, between the ages of 2 to 5. And then I also wrote a resource a few years ago called First Roll that was focused on elementary-aged students and playing role-playing games. So I'm going to kind of answer this question, how to play RPGs with kids in those 3 age categories. Very young, which is kind of that 2 to 5 age range. Elementary school, which is going to be 5 to 9, 5 to 10. And then middle school, which is going to be like 10 to 14. Now, if you're looking to play RPGs with kids that are very young, and this is kind of where I am in my life moment, having 2 kids in this age range, is you really have to do a lot of prep work. And this prep work's going to take time. And here's what I mean by prep work. You need to get the kids used to games. And so one of the things that I started doing quite early when my kids were even like 1.5, 2 years old, is I started playing games with them. And the games I played were not complex at all. In fact, I would argue they're activities and not actually games. But what they do is they teach how to play a game. So for example, we played a lot of matching. And what matching teaches is it teaches kids that turn taking is a part of the game. It teaches kids that they have a goal in the game. And it teaches kids kind of like tile flipping, that type of thing. I also play a lot of Candyland. I'm not a fan of Candyland, but it's okay because it teaches turn taking, it teaches card drawing, it teaches moving spaces on a track, and it teaches like the concept of discarding a card or reshuffling a deck and that type of thing. Also teaches winning, losing a goal, those types of things. So that's the first thing I would do is if you're looking to play an RPG with a kid at this very young age is just start playing games. Kids have no background at this age about what games are or how to play a game unless you show them. So you got to show them some of the basics, just turn taking, goals, maybe card manipulation, things like that. The other thing you should be doing if you want to play games, RPGs specifically with kids at this age, is you need to be reading them a lot of stories or telling them a lot of stories. So every night I read stories to my kids, and most nights I also make up a story on my own. And basically what this does is this allows the kid to begin imagining, being creative, and identify that, hey, what I think about in my head does not have to be reality around me. And that's also very important for when you play an RPG. Now, once you've gotten the kids that you want to play RPGs with a baseline of how to play a game, and they know what a story is and how to listen to stories, you can then combine those two things and try to play an RPG. Now, here's what I would suggest, and I've had success with this myself. The first thing I would suggest is just bring out a single piece of paper and start telling a story, but then tell the kid that in this story, they're the character and they get to make decisions. And so the first thing I did when I asked my kid, and when I sat down to play an RPG with my kid, is I said, hey, you get to decide parts of this story. Who do you want to be in this story? Who's your character? And my kid said, Princess Snow White. So I wrote that down on the piece of paper, did a little quick sketch, and my kid was delighted because they had a character in the story. Now, I definitely railroaded my kid in the initial phase of the story just to show them how it all worked. I had them encounter a dragon in a cave and then asked them what they wanted to do. And my kid was very creative and said they wanted to try and steal the dragon's treasure. And so I brought out a dice. I actually used a 20-sided dice because I felt that was a little bit more exciting than maybe a 6-sided. And I said, if you roll high, then your character will succeed. And if you roll low, your character might run into some trouble. And so over the course of the game, my kid was able to steal some treasure from the dragon, but then had to run away. But one of the things they stole was a map. So we drew a map together on the bottom part of the paper, and then we named the forest and the lake and the mountain on the map. And now in the game, what we're doing is my kid is exploring the different parts on the map, trying to find another treasure. And it's going really well. And I think the reason that it's going really well is because my kid, I set up some time to get my kid the background of games, and they knew what a story was. And then I was able to combine the two in a very story-heavy role-playing experience. In fact, we barely roll the dice. It's mostly just telling the story. But really, it's first of all very fun, but also it's kind of setting the stage for the next step. And the next step is when kids get to elementary school. Now, the big difference between an elementary school-aged kid when it comes to gaming and a very young age is, number one, most kids in elementary school, we're talking like 5 to 10 years old, are going to be able to read themselves, and that's a huge benefit. And number two, most kids do have experience with gaming, so you don't have to spend the extra time showing them what turns are or what cards are or what dice do. With elementary school-aged kids, you should still start with a story. All right, you should still start with a story that they want to be in. And the hardest part I've found with elementary school-aged kids is understanding that they control a character in the story, because some of the kids have such strong gaming experiences, whether on like an iPad or board games, that they don't understand the freeform nature environment of role-playing. And so that's kind of the first hurdle that you need to get over. But once you get over that, elementary school-aged kids can become very, very good role players. The limitation then is their ability to comprehend complex systems. So what I would suggest doing is start with a very, very simple system. Now, a few years ago, I wrote a system called The First Roll. The system is not unique. The book I wrote, First Roll, the short book I wrote, First Roll, really is the advantage of getting that is you get to learn what we're talking about now, which is understanding how to play RPGs with kids. But in that system, it was just the basic D6 system where you roll a 6-sided dice anytime the character wants to do something. And if it's a 6, the response from the game master is going to be yes and. If it's a 5, the response is going to be yes. If it's a 4, yes but. If it's a 3, no but. If it's a 2, no. And if it's a 1, no and. So basically it's on that spectrum. Whenever a character wants to do something, the dice will tell you how good or how bad the result of that actually is. And this works really, really well with kids at this level. The simple system can really build the understanding of role-playing games and begins pushing them towards that more complex level at the middle school aged. And the middle school age is really where I have, like I said, 6 years of game club experience with the middle school aged, and it's a lot of fun because the kids, as soon as they understand how to play a role-playing game, they pick things up very, very quickly. So every year when I did my game club, I sat down and taught how to play RPGs kind of near the beginning of the year. We always started with board games and then went to RPGs. The first thing I did at the middle school aged, especially for kids who didn't have any experience with RPGs, is I gave each kid a piece of paper, because in middle school they're all going to know how to write, read, and do kind of complex tasks on their own. And I said, okay, you're going to be a character in this story like Legolas from Lord of the Rings, or whatever they might be into. And I said, just write your character's name down on the very top of the paper. And so they did that. And then I railroaded the kids into some sort of forest encounter where they're fighting goblins or they're fighting some sort of like wolf pack or something like that. But I specifically didn't give them any items. I said, you are just your character, and you're just needing to fight. So the first thing it did is it forced the kids to be creative. And they said, oh, can I climb a tree to get away? Can I try and find a rock and throw a rock? Can I try and find a stick and use it as a spear? These were the ideas that the kids started coming up with when they realized that their character needed to do something to survive, but they didn't have an answer readily available. And this really taught them that they could influence the environment or impact the environment and kind of go off script. In video games, you can generally only do what the video game allows you to, but in role-playing games, you can really do anything your mind is able to come up with. So that's the first thing it taught them. The second thing I did then is I made the combat pretty quick, but I did make sure that someone got bloody. At the bottom of everyone's character sheet, if someone got damaged, I said, okay, you have 10 health, write a 10 on the bottom of your sheet, and then I would roll a 6-sided dice and say, okay, you took 4 damage. And so what the kids began to understand is that what they do in the story impacts their character sheet. And that's another tough concept that's not always easy to grasp. As soon as the combat was over, then I made sure that the kids found treasure, and once they found treasure, I made sure that they wrote that on their character sheet as well. And that created a very strong and quick positive feedback loop. And what I experienced when I was doing Game Club is that there was kind of a light bulb moment. And in this light bulb moment, the kids realized that the story was going to allow them opportunity to get the things they want, which they could then record on their sheet, and then they could manage their character how they wanted. And this usually, almost every year when I ran this kind of early role-playing game experience for the kids, kind of lit a wildfire, and the kids started expanding into all sorts of things. And at this point, after like one session or even like 10 or 15 minutes with some middle school kids, after giving them that type of experience, you can begin to introduce relatively complex systems. We're talking like regular Dungeons and Dragons and other systems. The one barrier to entry at the middle school level is a lot of games, even like Dungeons and Dragons, for some kids, that might be too many rules up front. And so starting with something a little bit more light or streamlined is going to get these kids playing faster, which would probably be beneficial for a lot of these kids. So yeah, that's how to play RPGs with kids. Just to recap, if you are going to be playing RPGs with kids at a very young age, ages 2 to 5, first, play games with them just to get them understanding and experiencing games. Second, read them stories, tell them stories. And then third, combine the two. Play a story where they get to play, or tell a story where they get to play a game within the story. At the elementary school aged level, be sure to introduce the idea of role-playing games where the kid has to understand, oh, I have a character in this game, and I can decide what my character is going to do, and then use a simple system where the kid is going to roll some dice to determine an outcome, kind of like what I laid out in First Roll. And then finally, at the middle school level, start with a simple system and create a tight positive feedback loop around the idea of the character sheet and the story and how the two interact. And as soon as the kids understand that, oh, those two things interact, and I can influence the story with my actions. They're going to be hooked, and you can start expanding to things that are a little bit more complex. Now, I do have 2 listener questions today. They're relatively short, so we're going to go through them here. Listener question number 1. How do you create memorable NPCs? Now, this is a pretty good question. This is something that I think most dungeon masters or game masters are going to ask at any time or at some time. And oftentimes this comes up from relatively new and inexperienced game masters or dungeon masters. Now, there's a lot of ways to answer this question, and I'm going to answer it kind of in a sense that you need to create an NPC that needs to be memorable, but you haven't had time to plan for it. So this happens a lot when I do some dungeon mastering. My players very creatively go off and do something I had not anticipated, and I realize, oh, now I need to give this NPC that I had not given a second thought to some sort of personality, because now they might be around for quite some time. So here's what I do. Basically there's 5 tools that I do. So here's the 5. The first one is I like to add some sort of hatred or suspicion from the NPC toward the player characters. Now, this takes place in... There's a hair floating. Sorry, not sure where that came from. This takes place in 2 different ways. First of all, I like to use the character's class as a way for the NPC to be a little bit prejudiced or biased or suspicious or hate, like have hatred toward them. So like maybe one of the players is playing a wizard, and then my NPC is going to have a deep mistrust for wizards. And that can create a lot of really interesting role-playing opportunities as the NPC begins to play favorites within the party, or the NPC is just going to give them false information based on the fact that they don't trust wizards. I do the same thing when it comes to what the characters are, kind of how they're acting or what they're carrying. There might be the NPC might really dislike violence, and so when the barbarian's carrying their big double-headed battle axe all over the place, the NPC is going to be a little angry about that, maybe antagonistic or a little suspicious, and that can create a memorable NPC and also really good role-playing opportunities. The second thing that I like to do is I like to create noticeable quirks for the NPC. And so that might be something like an accent, which is one of my favorite things to do, and my players absolutely hate it, so it's wonderful. It might be something like blinking a lot, like the NPC does a lot of blinking. Or it might be something annoying. That's another thing I like to do, is have the NPCs do something annoying, like blowing air through their teeth, like that type of thing. So those types of things can create memorable NPCs, and it's fun to get the groan out of your players when a recurring NPC comes back and has a very annoying trait, and the players go, oh, not them again. That's a lot of fun. The third thing I do if I need to create a personality for an NPC real quickly is I just use somebody or a character from a story that I know and just kind of input their personality into my NPC. So one of my go-tos is using people that I knew from high school and inputting their personality into the NPCs. You can do the same thing with stories that you've read, movies you've watched, things like that. I would suggest not using main characters because they're most well known. Like trying to put Frodo into an NPC is probably not going to be the best result, but putting Sam into an NPC or Gimli or Aragorn, I don't know, I'm on a Lord of the Rings on my mind, but any of these side kind of characters I think would work really well, and that way you don't have to make up this whole mannerisms and understanding how the NPC thinks. You already have the model for that. You've seen it in the movie or read it in the book. You can just have the NPC act like that person that you've already met or that person that you've already read about or watched in a movie. The fourth thing I do to make sure that my NPCs are a little bit memorable is I try to have some sort of physical appearance difference about them. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the NPC is going to be acting different or something like that, but what it does is it anchors the NPC in the player's minds so that it's easy to remember them going forward. So this could be something like a large scar across an NPC's face. It could be something like a missing eye. It could be something like missing fingers. And something really fun to do with this, if you use physical appearance as a way to differentiate your NPC, is if there's any amount of intrigue or deception or mystery in your story, you can kind of use that as a clue, right? So we're talking about For example, a mystery where something was stolen, you found some fingerprints, but you only find 3 fingerprints. And, you know, the the thing there is that, well, the character who's missing 2, or the NPC who's missing 2 fingers is going to fly to the top of the player's list as people to check out because they only found 3 fingerprints. So the last thing then that I would suggest if you're looking to create a memorable NPC is give that NPC a centric experience about something that the player or the player's character has. And so I like to do this when I want to give one of the player characters an opportunity to shine. For example, maybe the fighter has a sword, maybe it's a family heirloom, and then I'm going to create an NPC that is a huge sword nerd and loves swords and sees the fighter's sword and says, oh my gosh, is that a Dalsonian sword made of Dettermite steel? This has to be 100 years old. And then they take the sword, they take a look at it, and they see the maker's mark is at least 170 years old, and it's a rare one, and oh my gosh, this sword is so amazing. And it's a great way to put one of the player characters, kind of give them the spotlight, give them the opportunity to tell a little bit of their backstory, how they came about the sword, and interact with the NPC in a positive way. So that's probably one of my favorites. You can't do it that often because it gets a little tiring, but every once in a while, throw in an eccentric NPC who's just a big nerd of some kind and shares that love or knowledge of an item with one of the player characters. The second question I had, and this will be the last question for this episode and this season, is what Powered by the Apocalypse game is your favorite and why? So if you don't know what Powered by the Apocalypse is, I would suggest checking it out. In short, and I know some people are going to get angry at this description for me, but in short, Powered by the Apocalypse is a role-playing system that revolves around 2 things, two ideas. The first is the idea of moves, and that basically means that in this game, yes, your character, it's a role-playing game, your character can do anything, but basically your character, what they do in the game is going to revolve around 6 or 8 different moves. And generally speaking, when you do a move, you're going to roll maybe 2d6 is pretty common, and you're going to get one of 3 results. If the roll is high enough, it'll be successful, and you'll get to do the outcome. Most of the results are going to be mixed success, which means you get what you want, but there's a cost or a challenge associated to it. And then the last roll, of course, is if it's just an outright failure, and that usually isn't good for the character. So that's the first thing that Powered by the Apocalypse does, is it provides a list of moves, which kind of focuses the gameplay. And the second thing is a list of playbooks. And playbooks can be thought of as a list of classes, but they're different. Because in Dungeons & Dragons, when you think about wizard, they build the class of wizard so that any wizard you want to play from any kind of genre or trope can be fit into the wizard class. In Powered by the Apocalypse, playbooks are very, very, very specific and create a very tight gameplay experience that fit in one genre and one single trope. And so the playbooks aren't nearly as wide as something like a wizard's class in Dungeons & Dragons. Rather, you might be playing the Chosen One in a Monster of the Week style game. So that's Powered by the Apocalypse. Those are the 2 core tenets, I think, of a Powered by the Apocalypse game. You get the moves and you got the playbooks. Now, what is my favorite and why? And my favorite is Monster of the Week. It's the system that I used to run my Dresden Files / Supernatural game earlier this year. We played it in a Supernatural Minneapolis setting. I just took a lot of the Dresden Files stuff and moved it from Chicago to Minneapolis, but then I added some flavor, I added some influence from Supernatural, and it was a lot of fun. But I like Monster of the Week because, like I said, it does everything that a good Powered by the Apocalypse game does. It creates a really fun gameplay experience that's relatively focused on one genre, and then each player gets to experience one trope within that genre, and it was just a lot of fun. And so that's currently my favorite Powered by the Apocalypse game, Monster of the Week. And that brings us to the end of Season 1, the end of Episode 5, and the end of this podcast for now. I want to thank everyone for listening to the Paper Dice Games podcast. Season 2 will likely be coming. For Season 1, I set a number of internal goals, and I have reached all of my internal goals, so I likely will do a Season 2, but I don't know when, what the season focus is going to be or anything like that. So stay tuned. I'll let you know maybe in a few weeks what I have planned. But yeah, I'm just want to thank everyone for listening. It's been a lot of fun doing this, and hopefully you've had a lot of fun listening. You can get in touch with me about the podcast. Any responses you have, if you want to yell at me about anything, feel free to do so. Or any questions you have, you can reach me on Twitter @PaperDiceGames. You can reach me at email, paperdicegames@gmail.com. Or you can just leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. That would be great. So, thanks so much. I won't see you next week, but hopefully I will be seeing you all in Season 2.